Here's something nobody warns you about before you visit London. You can stand in front of Buckingham Palace for 20 minutes, camera in hand, watching a man who doesn't blink, and walk away feeling like you were the strange one. That's what happened to me, and I've been thinking about it ever since. It was a Tuesday in early October, and London had that particular kind of gray morning where the clouds sit low, and the air smells like old stone and rain that hasn't fallen yet. Not unpleasant, just heavy, like the city was holding its breath. I'd flown in from Toronto 2 days before for a work conference, and I had exactly one free morning. One. My colleague Marcus, who had done London 3 times before, told me to skip the palace. Tourist trap, he said, stirring his terrible hotel coffee. You've seen one guard. You've seen them all. I almost listened to him, but something pulled me toward it anyway. I took the tube to St. James's Park Station, walked up through the park with a coffee I bought from a small cart near the pond, and came out onto the wide open forecourt area facing the palace just before 9 in the morning. The iron gates were gleaming. The gravel was raked perfectly, and there in the sentry box to the left, standing so straight it almost looked wrong, the way a building stands straight, was the guard. I want to describe him properly because the details matter later. He was tall, not unusually tall, but the bearskin hat added another foot and a half at least, so the overall impression was of someone assembled for maximum vertical impact. Red tunic, perfectly pressed. Black boots that caught the gray light and gave it back a little shinier. White gloves, so clean they looked like they'd never touched anything. His face was young, mid-20s, maybe with a jaw that seemed carved rather than grown, and eyes that were fixed on some point in the middle distance that none of us civilians could locate. He wasn't moving. I don't mean he was standing still the way you stand still when you're waiting for something. I mean he was not moving. Not a sway. Not a shift of weight. Not even, and I was watching closely, a visible blink. There were maybe 30 other tourists scattered around the area at that hour. Some taking photos. Some reading their guidebooks. A small group of school children in matching high-vis vests being corralled by 2 exhausted teachers. A couple from what sounded like Japan, taking turns photographing each other in front of the gates. I drank my coffee and watched the guard. And I thought, how does anyone do that? I should give some context here because this story is really about what happened over the next 2 hours. And to understand why it affected me the way it did, you have to understand that I went in as a skeptic. I'm not easily impressed by ceremony. I grew up in a family that had no particular feelings about the monarchy one way or another. My dad used to say that pomp and circumstance was just expensive theater, and I'd absorbed that attitude without really examining it. So standing there, watching this young man perform his absolute stillness, my first instinct was analytical. Clinical almost. I started thinking about the training, the physical conditioning, how long they practice standing before they're trusted to do it in public. Whether there's a particular mental trick, counting breaths, reciting something internally, finding a focal point, and locking onto it. My second thought was more honest. I couldn't do it. I'm a person who fidgets. I check my phone compulsively. I can't watch a film without shifting positions at least 4 times. The idea of standing in one place in the open air, in front of strangers for hours, it triggered something almost like claustrophobia just thinking about it. The guard didn't seem troubled by any of this. He just stood there in the gray October morning and existed with a completeness that most people never manage for 30 consecutive seconds. Around 9:15, the tourists began to thicken. A tour bus arrived and deposited maybe 50 people at once, mostly American from the accents, armed with cameras, and a tour guide who spoke in the rapid, bright voice of someone who has explained the same things 300 times and has made a private peace with that fact. And the soldiers you see here belong to the household division, she was saying, gesturing broadly, and they are not permitted to speak, smile, or acknowledge the public during their duty. They are, however, permitted to issue a verbal warning if someone gets too close or poses a genuine obstruction. A man in a red baseball cap immediately walked up to within 2 feet of the sentry box and grinned at his wife for a photo. The guard didn't react. His eyes stayed fixed on that invisible point. The tour guide sighed the sigh of someone who has given up trying to prevent this particular behavior. I watched from a distance, still nursing my coffee, which had gone cold without me noticing. There was something in the guard's stillness that had started to feel less like discipline and more like, I don't know how to explain this exactly, like weather. Like he was a feature of the environment rather than a person inside it. The tourists flowed around him. People took photos and moved on. The school children stopped and stared and were moved along by their teachers. The couple from Japan finished their photos and walked toward the park. The guard stood. The clouds shifted overhead. The guard stood. A pigeon landed on the gravel about 4 feet from the sentry box, pecked at something invisible, and flew away. The guard stood, and I stayed. I don't know why I stayed. I'd finished my coffee. I had a conference panel at 11 that I really shouldn't be late for. Marcus would ask me later if it was worth it, and I wouldn't have a good answer. But I stayed. It started at about 9:40. I almost missed it because I've been looking at my phone, ironic, and when I looked up, the first one had already landed. A sparrow, small and brown and completely unimpressed with its own significance. It had landed on the top of the sentry box roof, just above the guard's head, and it was doing that little bird thing where it turns its head in rapid, jerky increments, looking at nothing with great intensity. I noticed it. A woman nearby noticed it and nudged her husband. The husband looked, nodded, and went back to his phone. The guard didn't move. The sparrow hopped to the edge of the roof, looked down, looked at the guard's hat, considered, and then I watched this happen. It hopped forward and landed on the brim of the bearskin, right on top of the guard's head. Not on the hat exactly, on the front edge of the hat, facing forward like a tiny figurehead on a very formal ship. A few people nearby made that involuntary sound, half laugh, half gasp, the sound you make when something happens that isn't supposed to. The guard's eyes didn't move. His posture didn't change by a single degree. The sparrow sat on his hat brim and looked out at the tourists with an expression of complete ownership. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because the sparrow sitting on the guard's hat was already a moment. People were taking photos. Someone was filming. There was a warm, delighted energy spreading through the small crowd that had gathered. That particular human joy that comes from watching something small and animal do something unexpected in a dignified setting. But the guard's response, or rather his absolute, total, committed non-response, was what turned it from a moment into something else. He didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He didn't shift his weight or twitch his shoulder or do any of the 10,000 small things a normal human being would do instinctively when a bird lands on their head. He just stood there, with a sparrow on his hat, looking, if anything, more dignified than before. And that's when the second bird arrived. Another sparrow, whether a companion of the first or simply an opportunist, I couldn't tell, landed on the right shoulder of the guard's tunic. It ruffled its feathers, settled, and then sat there with the relaxed confidence of something that has found exactly where it wants to be. The crowd's warm laughter became something quieter and more attentive. I took a step closer. The guard had 2 birds on him now, one on his hat, one on his shoulder, and he was standing so completely, so absolutely still that the birds had made no distinction between him and the sentry box itself, between the man and the structure, between living tissue and painted wood. He had become, in their small and practical bird assessment, architecture. I want to stop here and tell you something that I've thought about a lot since. There's a particular kind of discipline that goes beyond training. Training gets you to the point where you could do a hard thing. Real discipline, the kind that takes years and costs something, gets you to the point where the hard thing no longer registers as hard, where the effort has been so thoroughly absorbed into who you are that there's no gap left between the intention and the action. That guard had 2 birds on him, wild birds, with no regard for the dignity of the situation. Birds that had looked at this tall, still, red and black human shape and filed it under safe surface, no threat, suitable for perching. And he was giving them nothing. No invalentori masol twitch. No sarpek sale. No millimeter of movement that would have sent them spinning back into the sky. He was just there, completely there, in a way that most of us, most of the time, are not. I thought about the conference I was supposed to be at, about the panel discussion on quarterly projections, about Marcus and his hotel coffee, about all the things I was doing at any given moment that were not the thing I was actually doing. The guard was doing one thing, completely, without reservation or distraction or the constant low-grade negotiation with comfort that the rest of us conduct all day, every day, without noticing. And it turned out that was enough. It was more than enough. It was extraordinary. By 10 o'clock, there were 6 of them. 6 birds, on or around a single royal guard who had not moved in, by my rough calculation, just over an hour. Let me account for them, because I feel like they deserve that. 2 sparrows remained from the first arrival. One on the hat brim, the original, who seemed to have established some kind of territorial claim, and one on the left shoulder now, having migrated from the right at some point when I was looking elsewhere. A third sparrow had landed on the roof of the sentry box itself, and was moving in small nervous circles that had nothing to do with the guard and everything to do with the fourth bird, a starling, bold, and iridescent, that had landed next to it, and was simply taking up more than its allocated space. The fifth was a pigeon. A London pigeon, which is to say a bird with the weary, entitled confidence of someone who has lived in the same city for their entire life, and long since stopped being impressed by anything in it. It had landed at the base of the sentry box, directly at the guard's feet, and was investigating the toe of his boot with the detached curiosity of an appraiser looking at a property it has no intention of buying. The sixth, and this one I genuinely couldn't identify. I'm not a birder. My knowledge of small brown birds begins and ends at small brown bird had settled on the guard's left forearm, which was, I should mention, pressed flat against his side as part of the formal stance. So the bird was not perched on an outstretched limb. It was perched on a human arm that was being held with such complete rigidity that the distinction between the arm and a branch had apparently ceased to matter. The crowd around me had grown to perhaps 80 people. This was no longer a passing curiosity. This was a destination. The tour guide, the same one from before who had come back around on her loop, stopped mid-sentence when she saw the scene. She was telling her group something about the history of the bearskin cap, and she simply stopped mid-word and stared. Then she said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well, I've been doing this job for 11 years. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. An older man standing near me, English, I thought, from the particular quality of his stillness, turned to his wife and said, "That's something. Just that. That's something." And his wife reached over and took his hand, which seemed like the right response. A small girl, maybe 4 years old, was being held up by her father so she could see over the crowd. She was watching the birds with the specific focused attention that small children give to things that interest them, total, unblinking, with her mouth slightly open. After a moment she said, "Daddy, is he sleeping?" Her father said, "No, sweetheart, he's working." She considered this. "He works very quietly," she said. The father laughed, softly, and I wrote it down in the notes app on my phone because I didn't want to forget it. Around 10:15, something changed in the energy of the crowd. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small things, the growing number of people, the shifting of the light as the clouds thinned and a weak October sun began to push through, the fact that someone had started filming vertically and the phone screen was visible to everyone nearby, which made people suddenly conscious of the idea that this was a moment, a real moment, the kind that gets shared and passed around. People straightened up, found better angles, stopped talking, and in that collective hush, something became audible that had been there all along. The birds. Not birdsong exactly, just the small ambient sounds of 6 birds doing what birds do. The faint rustle of a wing being adjusted, the tiny percussive sound of a beak against the fabric of the tunic, the almost nothing weight shift of the sparrow on the hat brim repositioning itself. These sounds in a new quiet were enormous. And underneath them, or maybe this is something I imagined or constructed later from memory, was the sound of the guard breathing. Slow, regular, barely there. I had been standing in roughly the same spot for over an hour by this point. My feet were beginning to register their complaints in the way feet do when you ignore them a dull, spreading awareness of the pavement through the soles of my shoes. The guard, presumably, felt nothing, or felt it, and had stopped cataloging it. I'm not sure which is more impressive. At 10:23, I know the exact time because I had just glanced at my phone to calculate how late I was going to be for my conference. A man stepped out of the crowd and toward the sentry box. He was somewhere in his 30s, large, wearing a bright orange jacket that was difficult to look at directly. He had the specific energy of someone who has decided that the funniest thing he can do right now is interact with the guard. I've seen this energy before. It's not malicious exactly. It's the energy of someone who finds other people's composure vaguely challenging and has decided to test it. He stopped about 3 feet away, technically within the allowed distance, but barely, and started making faces, raised his eyebrows, puffed his cheeks, wiggled his fingers near his temples. He turned to the crowd with a grin, looking for accomplices, looking for the laugh that would validate the performance. Some people smiled uncomfortably. Most didn't. The guard's eyes didn't move. The man in the orange jacket escalated. He leaned in slightly, not crossing any line, still technically within bounds, and said something I couldn't hear. His tone was the patronizing, loud whisper voice of someone trying to provoke a reaction while maintaining plausible deniability. The crowd's energy shifted, not dramatically, but you could feel it, the subtle lean away that happens when something stops being charming and starts being something else. Here is the thing. The guard never looked at the man in the orange jacket. But, and I want to be precise about this because it matters, he moved, not a flinch, not a step, just his right hand, the one resting at his side, fingers extended, which very slightly and very deliberately straightened. A millimeter of additional formality. A degree of increased stillness, if that's even a coherent thing, like the stillness had been turned up the way you'd turn up the volume on something. That's the only way I can describe it. He became more present, and the man in the orange jacket, who had been grinning, who had been playing to the crowd, stopped grinning. I don't know exactly what happened in that 3-foot gap between them. The guard hadn't spoken, hadn't moved meaningfully, hadn't so much as altered his gaze, but something had communicated, something clear and non-negotiable had passed through the October air and landed on the man in the orange jacket and been understood without any ambiguity at all. He stepped back, made a vague gesture that was meant to look casual and didn't, wandered away to the left where his friends were standing and rejoined them without saying anything. I watched him for a moment after that. He had his phone out and was looking at it with the specific attention of someone who is using a screen to avoid looking at the thing they just walked away from. The crowd exhaled, not loudly, but collectively, and the guard stood, with his birds, as if nothing had happened, because as far as he was concerned, nothing had. There's a word in Japanese, zanshin, that I learned about years ago from a documentary about martial arts. It means, roughly, a continued state of awareness after completing an action. The idea that a skilled practitioner doesn't relax the moment a technique is finished. They maintain the same quality of focused presence, because the moment you let go of awareness is the moment something can happen. I thought about that word, watching the guard, because what he had done, the thing that had moved the orange jacket man back without a word, without an action that anyone could point to specifically, was, I think, a version of that. A radical, continuous quality of presence that was simply not available to be dismissed or diminished or provoked. Not because of physical size or the formality of the uniform or the authority of the institution behind him, though all of those things were present too, but because the guard was actually there, fully, completely, with no part of him somewhere else. And just that was enough. The sparrow on his hat adjusted its wings. The pigeon at his feet waddled a half circle and settled again. The October sun went back behind its cloud. I called Marcus from the tube on the way to the conference. He picked up on the second ring. Was it worth it? He asked immediately, before I could say anything. I thought about that for a second. About the 6 birds. About the small girl and her father. About the man in the orange jacket and the invisible thing that had passed between him and the guard. about standing in the cold for over an hour watching another human being achieve something I couldn't name. Yeah, I said. It was worth it. You're going to be late. I know. What even happened? I tried to explain it. I got about halfway through the Sparrows before I realized I was doing it wrong. Trying to make it into an anecdote, a funny story, a thing with a clean shape that could be transmitted in a phone call. It wasn't that kind of thing. I'll tell you later, I said. He made the sound he makes when he's not really listening anymore. I stared at the tube tunnel going past in the dark and thought about stillness. I was late to the conference. 40 minutes late, which in conference terms means you walk in during the part where someone is already making their third point, and the people at the ends of the rows look up at you with expressions that are politely trying not to be what they are. I slid into a seat near the back and opened my notebook and tried to listen. The speaker was talking about efficiency, optimizing output, reducing friction in workflows. All things I am professionally invested in. All things I spent the tube ride not thinking about at all. My mind kept drifting back to the palace, to the quality of the light at 10 in the morning, gray turning to pale gold, to the sparrow on the hat brim presiding, to the man in the orange jacket and the thing that had moved him back. I wrote in my notebook, not conference notes, just what does it take to be that still? And then underneath it, after a minute, is it emptying yourself out or is it filling yourself so completely there's no room left for distraction? I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure I have one now. 6 weeks after I got back from London, I was on a video call with a colleague, different colleague, not Marcus, talking through a quarterly presentation, and I found myself drifting, checking the corner of my screen, thinking about dinner, nodding at the appropriate intervals while being genuinely somewhere else entirely. And I thought about the guard. I thought he would not be nodding at the appropriate intervals while somewhere else entirely. And I pulled myself back into the room, or back into the rectangle of the video call, which is our version of the room now, and I was actually there for the rest of the call. It wasn't a transformation. It was just a moment of choosing, which I probably wouldn't have made without the image of a man standing still in October with birds treating him like a building. I've thought about him other times too. When I'm in a long meeting that isn't going anywhere, and I'm calculating how much sooner I can leave. When I'm reading something I should be reading, and the same paragraph isn't landing for the third time because my attention has gone somewhere it wasn't invited. When I'm having conversation with someone and I realize mid-conversation that I've stopped actually listening and have started waiting for the gap where I can say the thing I've already decided to say. He shows up, that guard, standing perfectly still in the gray London morning with a sparrow on his head, reminding me that it's possible. I want to tell you the last part now, the part I've been working up to, because there was something that happened right before I left the palace forecourt, right at the end, just before I turned and started walking toward the tube, that I haven't mentioned yet. The guard moved. Not the change of duty march, not the formal stamp and turn that I'd watched videos of online afterward, trying to understand the choreography of what I'd witnessed. Something quieter. His eyes moved, just his eyes, down briefly and then back up, and I followed the line of his gaze. The pigeon at his feet, the one that had been there the longest, investigating the boot, and then simply settling, treating the spot like its own private patch of London, had shifted, just slightly, had waddled an inch or two to the left, and in doing so, had put one of its feet on the toe of the guard's boot. Not a significant thing, objectively, a pigeon's foot on a boot, but the guard had looked down, one small downward flick of the eyes, half a second, then back up, and I couldn't read what was in that look. I was too far away, and I'm not good at reading faces at distance, and the bearskin hat threw shadow over his features. But it seemed to me, and maybe I'm projecting, maybe I'm constructing narrative the way people do when they want a moment to mean something. It seemed to me that there was something almost like acknowledgement in it. Like he saw the pigeon, not the irritant on his foot, not the violation of the protocol of the stance, not the problem to be managed. The bird. The actual bird, with its actual small life and its complete indifference to the significance of the boot it was standing on. And then he looked away again, and the pigeon waddled back to where it had been, and the moment was over. I've tried to explain this to a few people since. My sister, who is the more perceptive of the two of us, said, You sound like you had a religious experience in front of Buckingham Palace. She wasn't entirely wrong. Not religious exactly, but in the vicinity of religious. In the neighborhood of it. Because what I watched that morning was a person performing an act of sustained attention so complete and so costly. The cost of it is real, the physical cost, the mental cost, the cost of choosing that stillness over for every second of every minute of the duty, that the natural world simply did not categorize him as a threat. The birds didn't land on the tourists. They landed on him, not because he was inert, not because he was absent, but because he was so present, so contained, so entirely inside the form of what he was doing, that he had crossed some invisible threshold into a different kind of existing, one that the birds, in their small and practical wisdom, recognized. Here's what I've learned, or tried to learn, from a random Tuesday morning I didn't plan on having. Most of us live at about 60% presence, maybe less. We're in the meeting, but also thinking about the email. We're with the people we love, but also half-constructed in some imagined future conversation we might or might not ever have. We're standing in front of something extraordinary, a palace, a view, a person, and some piece of us is already writing the caption. We mistake motion for engagement, noise for substance, the constant production of reaction for actual attention. The guard wasn't reacting. He wasn't producing anything. He was just there at 100%, and it turned out that 100% of a person, just their full, undivided, unreserved presence, was enough to make the birds think he was part of the landscape. I think about that differently than I used to. I used to think the goal was to be remarkable, to do something visible, to generate enough output and noise that the world took notice. Now I think sometimes on the better days that maybe the goal is something quieter, to be so entirely where you are, so completely yourself, doing so fully the thing you're doing, that even the birds can tell. I went back to the palace on my last morning in London. I don't know why I expected it to be different. I don't know what I was hoping for. The forecourt was mostly empty at that hour. Early. A light rain. The tourists hadn't gathered yet. There was a guard in the sentry box. Not the same one. I had no way of knowing if it was the same one. They're not wearing name tags, and besides, I'd only seen his face for a total of about 3 seconds across the whole morning, the rest of it being hat and uniform and the invisible point in the distance. But a guard, standing in the way that they stand. I stood in the rain and looked at him for a while. No birds this time. Too cold, maybe, or too early, or the wrong guard, or just chance, the ordinary daily chance that makes some mornings remarkable and others just mornings. He stood. I stood. The rain came down very gently, the way London rain does, as if it's embarrassed to be too dramatic about it. And then I turned and walked to the tube and went to the airport and flew home. Marcus asked me at the airport if I'd gone back to the palace. I said yes. He said, "Anything happened?" I thought about it for a second. "No," I said. "Nothing happened." He nodded. "Tourist trap," he said, with the satisfaction of someone who has been proven right. I didn't argue with him. Some things aren't arguments. There's a version of this story where I wrap it up neatly, where I tell you that I went home and changed, that I'm more present now, more focused, better at being where I am when I'm supposed to be there. That would be too clean. What actually happened is that I went home and slipped back into my 60% life fairly quickly. The meetings, the distractions, the paragraph I read 3 times without it landing. The conversations where I'm half somewhere else. But here and there, on the better days, in the moments when I notice what I'm doing and choose to do it more completely, there's a man in a red tunic in the back of my mind, standing in the October light, with 6 birds on him, not looking, not reacting, not doing anything at all except being absolutely, completely, unreservedly there. And the world, in its small and quiet way, arranging itself around him. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Not the drama of it, not the ceremony, not the uniform or the institution or the 2 centuries of tradition behind the gesture. Just the presence, just the willingness to be fully in the place you've chosen to stand. And trust that something, even something as small and uncomplicated as a bird, will eventually notice.